Good morning. I'm so pleased to be with you today as part of your Great Ideas lecture series. In preparation for being with you, I spent some time familiarizing myself with Carson-Newman. You have every reason to be proud of your founders, as your institution can trace its roots back to 1851, quite something when you consider the context of our nation at that time. In 1880, the university was named Carson College and for several years existed alongside Newman College, a separate facility for the education of women, which was a very progressive idea for that time, and still is in many parts of the world. In 1889, the two colleges united as one of the first coeducational institutions in Baptist circles, also quite progressive. Your mission, to help students reach their full potential as educated citizens and worldwide servant leaders by integrating academic excellence and Christian commitment within a caring community, is an ideal fit for what I will share with you today, that education for all people, especially girls and women in the developing world, is key to stewarding well the resources God has given us. First, I'd like to provide a context for why I believe Malala's actions should... I've got a little mess up in my speech here. I did a copy-paste thing and moved a paragraph and didn't check it after it printed, so sorry. In November of 2009, I ordered my first copy of Half the Sky. I eventually purchased 300 copies and disseminated them throughout my networks in Christian higher education. Half the Sky is one of my top 10 books, maybe even top 5, right up there with the Bible, The World is Flat, Pride and Prejudice, and Nancy Drew. You remember the old clock, don't you, ladies? I was able to meet co-author Cheryl Woodun last year at Pepperdine University, where she spoke about the work that led to writing Half the Sky, and told students that they are fortunate to live and learn, for most of them to have been born in the United States, that where someone is born can mean everything. Indeed, if you are a girl, it can mean the difference not only between being educated or not, but also whether you live or die. A couple of years ago, I was on a plane out to Seattle. I was living in Washington, D.C., and I made a connection in Chicago, and I was going to a meeting at World Vision of leaders from across Christian higher education. I had read 3 or 4 papers, and then I pulled out my copy of Half the Sky with my highlighter. And as I went through it, the lady across the aisle from me looked over and said, "You've got that book." No one else had ever done this to me on a plane before. And I said, "Yes, I bought 200 copies," because by then I'd had 200, not 300. And then she started telling me about how she and her colleague next to her, this man's name is Tom Yellen, he was the executive producer for Peter Jennings of ABC News for 18 years. She and Tom were on their way to Seattle to not only meet with World Vision leaders, but also to meet with the Queen of Jordan's chief of staff, to do the preparation work for what would become the Half the Sky PBS documentary. For a couple of hours, Holly Gordon and I talked about faith, how she grew up, why she didn't have faith, but why she was so taken with the message within the Half the Sky book. Half the Sky is a secular book, and it's based on all sorts of statistics that are from CARE and UNICEF and the United Nations and all these kinds of nonprofits and government agencies. But it includes in a very favorable way many Christian organizations and the work they do around the world. So Half the Sky raised new awareness and challenged old ways of thinking. Traditionally, in philanthropic, nonprofit, and government contexts, the status of women has been seen as a soft issue, worthy but marginal. Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodun, the married couple who authored the book, wrote that they also initially reflected that view in their work as journalists, that women's issues were soft issues, but they preferred working with trade disputes or arms proliferation. But their awakening came in China. After they married in 1988, they moved to Beijing to be correspondents for the New York Times. 7 months later, they found themselves standing on the edge of Tiananmen Square, watching troops fire their automatic weapons at pro-democracy protesters. The massacre claimed between 400 and 800 lives and transfixed the world. The following year, they came across an obscure but meticulous demographic study that outlined a human rights violation that had claimed tens of thousands more lives. This study found that 39,000 baby girls died annually in China because parents didn't give them the same medical care and attention that boys received, and that was just in the first year of life. A result is that as many infant girls died unnecessarily every week in China as protesters did at Tiananmen Square. As those Chinese girls never received a column inch of news coverage, Christophe and Boudin began to wonder if their journalistic priorities were skewed. A similar pattern emerged in other countries. In India, a bride burning takes place approximately once every 2 hours to punish a woman for an inadequate diary or to eliminate her so a man can remarry. But these rarely constitute news. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, developed a gauge of gender inequality that is a striking reminder of the stakes involved. More than 100 million women are missing, Sen wrote in a classic essay in 1990 in the New York Review of Books, spurring a new field of research. Sen noted that in normal circumstances, women live longer than men, and so there are more females than males in much of the world. Yet in places where girls have a deeply unequal status, they vanish. China has 107 males for every 100 females in its overall population, and an even greater disproportion among newborns. And India has 108. This has profound implications for society. The implication of the sex ratios, Sen later found, is that about 107 million females are missing from the globe today. Follow-up studies have calculated the numbers slightly differently, deriving alternative figures for missing women of between 60 and 107 million. Girls vanish partly because they don't get the same health care and food as boys. In India, for example, girls are less likely to be vaccinated than boys and are taken to the hospital only when they are sicker. A result is that girls in India from 1 to 5 years of age are 50% more likely to die than boys their age. In addition, ultrasound machines have allowed a pregnant woman to find out the sex of her baby and then get an abortion if it is a female. The global statistics on the abuse of girls are numbing. It appears that more girls and women are now missing from the planet precisely because they are female than men were killed on the battlefield in all the wars of the 20th century. The number of victims of this routine gendercide far exceeds the number of people who were slaughtered in all the genocides of the 20th century. Half the Sky spawned a movement that gained momentum and interest and recently inspired a 4-hour PBS documentary film and national broadcast event. Filmed in 10 countries, the series puts a human face to an otherwise abstract idea or string of statistics that could never convey the true human cost, and it illuminates the spirit of perseverance that is embodied by the women and girls who face these violations each day, and those who have made it their life's mission to help them. A girl in India is on the brink of being sold into the commercial sex trade. A young mother in Somalia may die giving birth. In Sierra Leone, a girl has been raped and must confront the norms of her community. A woman whose husband abused her now helps those suffering at the hands of their spouses. With a book, a teenage girl in Vietnam takes the first steps towards breaking the cycle of grinding poverty that plagues her family. Dozens of former impoverished individuals seeking economic independence band together to establish what will become Kenya's fastest-growing microfinance organization. These are the stories of individuals who represent hundreds of millions of women and girls around the world who are victimized and abused, denied access to education, medicine, or property, prevented from reaching their full potential and contributing in more meaningful ways to their communities. But these are also the stories of victories, large and small, in the face of the longest odds. My institution, Belmont University, sponsored a viewing of the series for students. Speaking of the longest odds, how about surviving being shot twice by the Taliban? That's exactly what Malala Yousafzai has done. Malala is a 15-year-old political activist, writer, journalist, and advocate of girls' rights to education in Pakistan. She publicly spoke out about the Taliban regime. Because of her boldness, the Pakistani Taliban decided to kill her, stating that they were forced to act because their previous death threats to silence her were not effective. As she and her peers were on their way home from school, a Taliban gunman stormed their bus, shouting, "Which one of you is Malala? Speak up, otherwise I will shoot you all." Malala and 2 other girls were shot, though the others were not seriously injured. Pakistani surgeons worked to stabilize Malala, and she was eventually flown to the UK, where she is at a hospital that specializes in serious injury and trauma. Physicians are amazed that, though she has a long recovery ahead, she's made astounding progress. They can find no serious brain damage, and she is standing and talking. Malala's passion for politics and girls' rights to education was initially inspired by her father when she witnessed his courage as he stood up for girls' education in their community. In 2008, when Malala was 11 years old, she started blogging for the British Broadcasting Corporation. The BBC had been looking for a novel way to describe the growing influence of the Taliban in Pakistan. They came up with the idea of having a schoolgirl discuss her life, highlighting the fact that she could no longer pursue an education under Taliban rule. Their correspondent in Peshawar had been in touch with a local schoolteacher, Zadun Yousafzai, but couldn't find any students willing to do it. It was too dangerous, their families said. Finally, Yousafzai suggested that his own daughter, 11-year-old Malala, would be a good candidate. She chose a pseudonym, Gul Mukhai, the name of a heroine from a Pashtun folktale, and began dictating her diary to a BBC correspondent each week over the phone. She described going on trips to buy bangles, living in a place as beautiful as the Swat Valley, and the disappointment of being banned from school by the Taliban. It was just the sort of personal story the BBC had been looking for. The BBC correspondent said, "We were absolutely thrilled by the way she was writing. I wouldn't call it mature. I would call it very, very fresh, untainted, and straight from the heart sort of take on what was going on. She would use these little anecdotal bits to bring out the atmosphere of fear surrounding schools and children in particular." She was clearly a very, very intelligent and a very observant girl. The entries, which ran on BBC websites from January to March 2009, were a hit with Pakistani readers in the United Arab Emirates, India, the United States, Canada, and the UK. As well as being translated into English for the BBC, her entries were regularly reproduced in local Pakistani media. She had a huge audience, both local and international. Given the danger of speaking out, the BBC knew that she would need to remain anonymous, but Malala's father allowed her to give speeches, and she increasingly took on a public activist role. By 14, she was leading school rallies and events for girls' rights to education. She received the International Children's Peace Prize, National Youth Peace Prize, and the Game Changers 2011 Award, in addition to holding national media events as she championed the cause of girls' education. Malala's shooting has garnered the world's attention. Hopefully she will continue to recover and will be an even more influential presence as her country works to improve opportunities for all of their citizens. Gail Lemon, author of the New York Times bestseller The Dressmaker of Kahar Khana and a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, writes critically of the Pakistani dignitaries who have spoken of their support and have visited her in the hospital, but who, until Malala's attempted assassination and the world attention it has garnered, they had not dared to challenge publicly the kind of extremism, the Taliban, that views educated girls as an existential threat. On CNN.com, Lemon writes that there are many Malalas whose stories are rarely heard. Just as this courageous girl refused to silently abandon her right to education, even at the risk of losing her life, women and men fight daily against a worldview that considers girls' schools a call to action in their battle against modernity. A few days ago, these fighters struck again in Afghanistan, bombing a girls' high school in the largely peaceful Bamiyan province. And their stories serve as a reminder of the stakes involved in the fight against extremism and for modernity. Another unheralded citizen who battled the extremism that threatens his country was Khan Mohammed, the head of the Porak Girls' School in Logar Province, an hour from Afghanistan's capital. Khan Mohammed ignored a series of Taliban warnings to stop teaching his students, and he was killed in May 2011. Few headlines attended his murder, but he is and was not alone in his quest to keep girls in school. For years, Gail Lemon has interviewed young women as courageous and committed as Malala and Khan Mohammed, who refused to submit to threats and abandon their education and their future dreams. One young midwife told Lamont that she decided to pursue her profession to save women's lives after her father rushed her out of Kandahar during the Taliban's rule of Afghanistan in the late 1990s. This is the story of the dressmaker of Khair Khanum. A Taliban fighter wanted to marry her, an offer her father could never have refused. So he invented a family wedding in Pakistan and whisked all of his daughters back to Kabul, where they lived until the Taliban fell in 2001. As soon as schools reopened in 2002, her father insisted she return to her studies. In 2004, she joined the first class of midwifery training. Lamont writes that this year, the fight to keep girls in school has grown even tougher as the Taliban turns classrooms into battlefronts to a greater extent than ever before. The United Nations mission in Afghanistan has verified 34 attacks against schools in the first 6 months of this year, including cases of burning of school buildings, targeted killings and intimidation of teachers and school officials. I'll say that again, targeted killings and intimidation of teachers and school officials, armed attacks against and occupation of schools, and closures, particularly of girls' schools. Lamont is often asked whether America's views are being imposed on others when it comes to promoting girls' education in countries like Afghanistan. She replies that those pushing this struggle forward are not foreign. They are people like Khan Muhammad, the teacher assassinated simply for going to work, and the young midwife whose father pushed her to get an education and pursue her dreams of a career. All that the world can do is to support these homegrown education fighters. Statistics show that investing in girls' education provides among the highest returns when it comes to goals ranging from greater food security to more robust economic growth. Every additional year of primary education offers women a 10 to 20% increase in earnings, and each additional year of secondary education can increase future wages by 15 to 25%. Increasing the number of women who complete secondary education by merely 1% boosts annual capita income growth by 0.3%, and in desperately poor countries like Afghanistan, where per capita gross GDP hovers around $500, every bit of growth is needed. Beyond the economic benefits, girls' education fosters stability. It has been said that there is no clearer route to economic development, political stability, and ultimately peace than education. Assassinating Khan Muhammad and shooting Malala Yousafzai will not extinguish girls' desire to create their own brighter future for themselves, their families, and their communities, no matter where they are in the world. Their push against forces that would take their countries backward in time and for the education that makes stability and prosperity a possibility is a high-stakes battle. But why should this matter to us today, as we enjoy the security of this place, as we experience the routine pursuits of life on a Christian university campus? Carson-Newman's mission, to help students reach their full potential as educated citizens and worldwide servant leaders by integrating academic excellence and Christian commitment within a caring community, is actually an audacious goal, one that is desperately needed by the world. Education for all people, especially girls and women in the developing world, is key to stewarding well the resources God has given us. Perhaps the founders of Carson College and Newman College were thinking of stewarding well the resources God had provided as they began back in the 19th century. They made sacrifices that laid the foundation for what grew into the institution you know today. That is not an uncommon story. In fact, that's how most colleges and universities began. You're in college so that you can become a better version of yourself, to be developed, stretched, nurtured, and prepared for a bright future, to become educated citizens and worldwide leaders. Education, especially higher education, private higher education, is a privileged one that comes with an expectation of paying it forward into the future. I am especially passionate about Christian higher education because of its transformative nature and because it calls us to lead and serve, especially in a global context. Earlier, I mentioned that where a person is born makes all the difference. It's about role models, opportunities, infrastructure, school systems, governments, churches, Little League, and the like. We have privilege that we don't even know we have. With that privilege comes the responsibility to have an awareness of others' situations and to speak up, stand up, and support whatever is good and beautiful and true. Carson-Newman is a liberal arts institution. As such, it nourishes and transmits the noblest ideas of Western culture, the achievements of science and technology, as well as the artistic, intellectual, and ethical heritage of the Western world. University leaders are committed to the sharpening of the mind, the ennobling of the heart, the broadening of the vision, and the cultivation of the arts of speaking and writing that result in civilized and fruitful discourse. Your faculty want you to think, to question, to doubt, to believe, and to affirm, to figure out who you are, to identify your giftedness, to fulfill the potential God has given you. A Christian university has the privilege and responsibility to teach that there are sources of truth deeper than those of secular culture. Moses, purveyor of divine laws. Amos, crying out for justice and unfeigned piety. Deborah, prophetess, judge, and mighty warrior. Paul, overwhelmed with both the reality of sin and the joy of forgiveness. And ultimately Jesus, in whom God is uniquely revealed, and by whose death and resurrection all humankind can receive reconciliation with God. Scripture calls us to love our neighbor, and we know that modern travel and technology mean that we are connected globally, that our neighbor who literally lives next door to us one day might be halfway around the globe the next, and we are still called to love that person. Scripture also calls us to seek justice for those who cannot seek it for themselves. Malala, in spite of her circumstances, continues to seek justice for herself and others. And her courage is a tremendous example to the world. In the summer of 2011, I came across a column that Nick Kristof, who is not a religious person, had written about what he called the God Gulf. Writing in response to the New York elites who spoke disparagingly at cocktail parties about Christians, he wrote, "Christianity often has been ridiculed among progressives as reactionary, myopic, anti-intellectual, and if anything, immoral." Now let me say that one more time. He's in New York, where pretty much they set the agenda for the rest of our nation, New York and DC, maybe Los Angeles, for what we talk about, for the discourse that happens on television and on the internet, in the newspapers. So he's at cocktail parties because he works for the New York Times, and he's a very famous person because of his following on Twitter and other places. Christianity often has been ridiculed among progressive as reactionary, myopic, anti-intellectual, and if anything, immoral. Yet that casual dismissal is profoundly unfair of the movement as a whole. This man is defending our faith. It reflects a kind of reverse intolerance, sometimes a reverse bigotry, directed at tens of millions of people who have actually become increasingly engaged in issues of global poverty and justice. This compassionate strain of evangelicalism was powerfully shaped by the Reverend John Stott, a gentle British scholar who had far more impact on Christianity than media stars like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell. Mr. Stott, who died a few days ago at the age of 90, so this was last summer, was named one of the globe's 100 most influential people by Time magazine. Mr. Stott didn't preach fire and brimstone on a Christian television network. He was a humble scholar whose 50-odd books counseled Christians to emulate the life of Jesus, especially his concern for the poor and oppressed, and confront social ills like racial oppression and environmental pollution. But in reporting on poverty, disease, and oppression, I've seen so many others, Kristof writes. Christians are disproportionately likely to donate 10% of their incomes to charities, mostly church-related. More important, go to the front lines, at home or abroad, in the battles against hunger, malaria, prison rape, obstetric fistula, human trafficking, or genocide. And some of the bravest people you meet are Christians who truly live their faith. He goes on, "I'm not particularly a religious person myself, but I stand in awe of those I've seen risking their lives in this way, and it sickens me to see that faith mocked at New York cocktail parties." Kristof continues, "Why does all this matter? Because religious people and secular secular people alike do fantastic work on humanitarian issues, but they often don't work together because of mutual suspicions. If we could bridge this God gulf, we would make far more progress on the world's ills. And he concludes, and that would be, well, a godsend. Christophe and Moudon in Half the Sky reference many Christian organizations that are doing fantastic work to help those mired in poverty and political conflict in developing nations. International Justice Mission and World Vision are included in the book. I think of Christophe in particular as a sort of Pied Piper of world issues, especially having to do with gender violence and girls' education, and I wonder if his many interactions with people of Christian faith might cause him to consider that faith for himself one day. I was a first-generation student, someone who would be at risk of not persisting through to graduation in today's nomenclature. My mother, who was mentally ill, had an 8th grade education. My childhood was one of adversity, for sure, yet I was most definitely privileged when you compare my life to those living in developing contexts. When I was 14, I was adopted into my church family, who would 4 years later send me to Abilene Christian University after my brother's suicide. Because I grew up in a neighborhood of caring, educated, faithful people, the trajectory of my life changed. My Christian liberal arts education, which was a gift from God, transformed my life. I married someone who would go on to earn a PhD from an educated family of church leaders, a mayor, several teachers and business leaders, a city council chair, and even a justice on the 4th Court of Appeals will sit around our Thanksgiving table. The church that sent me to college and the family I married into are wonderful examples of people who looked beyond their comfort and context to see who they might help, where they might be salt and light in their community. I would eventually become an English professor and university administrator. I was blessed to have a Christian higher education, and my presence here today is part of my paying that forward. Today I stand with you on one side of the God Gulf, sharing important information and opportunity so that you can have an even deeper understanding of your privilege and its corresponding responsibility. No matter what your future, you will know that the world can change for the better when girls and women are educated, and that it's happening now. And I would add that much of the boys' education in this part of the world is not what we would call education, because it's ideologically driven, and it tears down walls instead of it creates silos of ideology that are not helpful in our geopolitical context. The first step is awareness, and that awareness will go on to shape your attitudes and actions as you make decisions about careers, where to live, what to study, graduate school, etc. And let's not ever forget that when educating a girl, everyone, girls, boys, women, and men, achieves a better existence. The linked problems of forced prostitution, gender-based violence, and maternal mortality, which needlessly claim one woman every 90 seconds, present the single most vital opportunity of our time, the opportunity to make a change. All over the world, women are seizing this opportunity. Everyone who desires a more peaceful world has a stake in the outcome. May God continue to bless you as you discern His will for your life, and may girls around the world have access to quality education.